What if the most influential spiritual figure in Western history carried a secret the world has yet to fully uncover? In the depths of our spiritual narrative lies a mystery so profound that few dare to question it. A peculiar silence, an unexplained void, a gap that spans 18 critical years in the life of the man revered by billions, Jesus of Nazareth. Have you ever paused to consider this unusual absence in the sacred texts? The scriptures mention Jesus at birth and again at the age of 12, astonishing elders with his insight at the temple. Then silence. For nearly 2 decades, there is not a single word until he reemerges at age 30, being baptized in the Jordan River, prepared to begin a ministry that would change the world. What happened during those 18 defining years? Where was the spiritual teacher who would come to reshape the course of history during the prime of his youth? This is not a minor footnote in the sacred narrative. This is possibly the most significant untold story in the evolution of human spirituality. A deliberate omission that shaped and perhaps limited the spiritual understanding of billions. These lost years are not merely undocumented. They were systematically erased from the official record. So, the real question is not just where Jesus was during that time, but why those chapters were so carefully left out of the story that would become the foundation of Christianity. What if the cornerstone of Western spirituality was built upon only a fraction of the true path walked by its founder? What if, instead of being solely shaped by Jewish tradition, Jesus spent his formative years immersed in the wisdom of the East, learning from some of the most advanced spiritual traditions on earth? Such a possibility would radically transform not only our understanding of Jesus' teachings, but also the artificial boundaries we've drawn between Eastern and Western spirituality. Astonishing as it may seem, evidence hidden in plain sight points to an extraordinary journey during these lost years. A journey that may have taken Jesus far beyond the narrow borders of Judea, along ancient trade routes stretching to India, Tibet, and Persia. Throughout monasteries, temples, and mystery schools across the ancient world. The young Jesus is believed by many to have not only studied, but mastered esoteric knowledge that would later shape the core of his revolutionary teachings. Let's begin by examining what the official records reveal, and more importantly, what they omit. The canonical Gospels speak of Jesus' birth and a solitary event at age 12, where he amazes scholars in the Temple of Jerusalem. After that, they fall silent until he reappears at age 30. This gap accounts for nearly 60% of Jesus' life before his public ministry, a staggering omission for what is often considered a divinely inspired biography. Yet this void wasn't always empty. In the early centuries of Christianity, multiple texts circulated describing Jesus' life during this undocumented period. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Arabic Gospel of the Infancy, and other apocryphal accounts attempted to fill the silence. However, these were all excluded when the biblical canon was established at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, under the close supervision of Emperor Constantine. Why were they rejected? Many of these narratives depicted Jesus traveling far beyond Judea, studying with Eastern sages, Egyptian initiates, and other spiritual masters. Such a portrayal did not align with the emerging theological framework of the Roman Church. A Jesus who learned from Buddhist monks or Brahmin priests, who was initiated into the esoteric schools of Egypt, or meditated in the Himalayas, would challenge the claim that his wisdom was entirely divine and unprecedented. Instead, it would place him within a broader universal spiritual tradition. Historically, these journeys were not just plausible, they were likely. The ancient world was far more interconnected than we often imagine. By the 1st century, well-established trade routes, such as the Silk Road, linked the Roman Empire to India and China. Alexandria, a bustling Egyptian city, was the intellectual heart of the ancient world, home to the greatest library ever assembled. It attracted scholars and mystics from across the globe. Jewish communities had already spread across this vast network. Large Jewish populations existed in Babylon, Persia, Egypt, and even India, maintaining synagogues and cultural ties with Jerusalem. A spiritually curious young man could have easily traveled these routes, staying with Jewish families along the way. Consider the timing. The so-called lost years of Jesus' life coincided with the most stable period of the Roman Empire, the Pax Romana, a time when long-distance travel was safer and more feasible than ever before in human history. The conditions were ideal for such extensive journeys, right during the time Jesus disappears from the historical record. But speculation alone isn't enough. What tangible evidence suggests that Jesus traveled during these undocumented years? Surprisingly, the trail begins in the east. Ancient Buddhist texts from the Himalayas refer to a mysterious foreign teacher named Issa, who came from the west to learn the teachings of the Dharma. In 1887, Nicholas Notovich, a Russian explorer, claimed to have discovered ancient manuscripts in the Hemis Monastery in Ladakh, modern-day India, detailing the life of Issa, who had come to study with monks in India and Tibet during the exact years missing from the Gospels. According to these texts, Issa, identified by many as Jesus, studied Hindu philosophy and Buddhist meditation for years before returning to the West. While Notovich's claims were met with skepticism, later researchers such as Swami Abhidananda and Nicholas Roerich independently traveled to the same monastery and confirmed the existence of similar documents. Even more compelling than these historical reports are the striking philosophical parallels between Jesus' teachings and Eastern wisdom traditions. Concepts such as loving one's enemies, nonviolence, detachment from material wealth, and the idea that the kingdom of God is within echo core Buddhist and Vedantic principles that predate Jesus by centuries. This isn't mere coincidence. These are specific frameworks of spiritual practice that were absent in mainstream Jewish teachings of his time. Further evidence lies in linguistics. Jesus frequently referred to himself using the Aramaic term Bar Nasha, meaning Son of Man. Curiously, the same expression was commonly used in Aramaic translations of Buddhist texts during that period to describe an enlightened being, someone who had transcended worldly illusions. Likewise, Jesus often referred to his message as the Way, a term that directly mirrors the Buddhist Eightfold Path and the Taoist concept of the Tao, both describing a spiritual path of discipline and awakening. These aren't vague resemblances. They are technical terms embedded in spiritual traditions that were flourishing along the trade routes of the East. How did they find their way into the language of a Galilean preacher? Even archaeology offers clues. In Kashmir, there exists a mysterious tomb known as the Rosabal Shrine, which local traditions identify as the burial place of a prophet named Issa. This figure, described as a wise teacher who came from the West, bears striking similarities to Jesus. The name Issa is interpreted by some scholars as meaning Jesus the Gatherer. Intriguingly, the tomb is aligned in an east-west direction, a burial custom consistent with Jewish practice, but not Islamic. But perhaps the most persuasive evidence of Jesus' Eastern education lies within his own teachings. When Jesus reappears at age 30, he speaks with a level of authority and mysticality that astonishes even the religious elite of his day. Over and over, his contemporaries ask, "Where did this man get this wisdom?" A question that implies they recognized he had been trained beyond the bounds of conventional Jewish education. The Sermon on the Mount, one of Jesus' most famous discourses, is radically different from standard Jewish teachings of the time. However, it closely resembles Buddhist sutras, especially the Dhammapada, with its emphasis on humility, compassion, and the inner path to spiritual awakening. Jesus' focus on detachment from desire, the embrace of suffering, and the transcendence of the ego echoes both Buddhist and Vedantic doctrines. Even his method of teaching, using parables and riddles, resembles the style of Zen koans, designed to provoke deep contemplation and direct experience of truth. He once instructed his followers to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, a phrase that perfectly captures the Taoist balance of opposites. His declaration that the kingdom of God is within you mirrors the Upanishadic idea that the divine Atman resides within each individual. None of these ideas were mainstream in first-century Judaism. They had to come from somewhere else. The consistency of these concepts across his teachings strongly suggests direct contact with the philosophies where they originated. Jesus' healing techniques offer further confirmation. His use of touch, the transfer of spiritual energy, and emphasis on the recipient's faith closely resemble Ayurvedic and Tibetan healing methods. His retreats into solitude for prayer and contemplation mirror the meditative practices of Eastern mystics rather than Jewish rituals. Egypt, too, appears to have played a pivotal role in Jesus' development. According to the Gospel of Matthew, his family fled to Egypt shortly after his birth to escape King Herod's decree. While the canonical texts say little more, Egypt was known as a center of esoteric knowledge for millennia. Alexandria, in particular, was the melting pot of Greek philosophy, Jewish mysticism, Egyptian initiations, and Eastern spirituality. It's also where a sect known as the Therapeutae lived, a contemplative Jewish community practicing healing and meditation techniques eerily similar to those Jesus would later employ. The very name Therapeutae means healers, a description frequently applied to Jesus. Symbolic parallels between Jesus' ministry and Egyptian and mystery schools are striking. His themes of death and rebirth, the baptismal initiation, and the resurrection align with ancient rituals designed to awaken the higher self. Even the act of teaching in secret to a select group of disciples reflects the model used in esoteric traditions, where sacred truths were transmitted only to those spiritually prepared to receive them. Why then was all this erased? Because a Jesus shaped by Eastern wisdom and universal spiritual insight would pose a threat to the centralized authority of the early church. He would be a bridge between worlds, not a gatekeeper of one. A spiritual revolutionary whose message transcended dogma and pointed directly to divine experience within. By narrowing the official biography of Jesus to a few select years, the early church could present him as a divine anomaly, rather than the product of a long and deliberate spiritual apprenticeship. But now that we know more, now that we can trace the footprints of the man called Jesus across deserts, mountains, and temples, what do we do with this knowledge? Perhaps we begin to understand that truth is not confined by doctrine, that wisdom flows through many rivers, and that Jesus may have walked among them all. Maybe the real miracle is not that he appeared suddenly at age 30, but that he returned, transformed by a universal truth, to remind us that the divine is not a destination, but a path, a way, and he walked it long before he ever preached it.